Well, howdy. So we're getting ready for Sunday. There's actually a couple topics I wanted to cover. I don't know if I'm going to have time for everything, but we're going to be talking about Noah, going through the roll call of faith. And with Noah, of course, we're talking about the flood. And an issue with the flood that immediately comes up for a lot of people is, was it genuinely a worldwide flood or was it a local flood? And so I thought I can't cover this from the pulpit, so I wanted to cover it here. First of all, I want to note this is not a first tier issue. By first tier, I mean this does not decide whether you are Christian or not. Christians have different opinions on whether it was local or global. This is not a primary divisive issue, even at the denominational level. We can have people in this church, in Reliance Baptist Church, that are on both sides of this issue. And no matter how strongly you feel about this, it should not divide us. With that said, however, it is an indicator of your hermeneutics, or how you interpret Scripture. And it tells a little bit about how seriously you take Scripture. Now, when I say this, I want to be cautious not to mean too much. Now, there's a wide spectrum. Let me give you an example. First of all, my opinion, it's a worldwide flood, but let me give you two individuals, William Lane Craig and Gavin Ortlund. Both think it was a local flood, or based on a local flood. But these two men, while having the same general opinion, see it very differently, and it tells us a little bit different about these men. William Lane Craig, who is a phenomenal apologist and a brilliant man, nonetheless chalks all of this entire story up to myth based on some small floods at some point. It was a real flood, but it was local, and it got just turned into this giant story. I'm sorry. William Lane Craig is a brilliant apologist and a horrible theologian. And I'm perfectly happy to say that publicly. Now, I'd never debate the man. He'd make me look like a fool. But nonetheless, that's my opinion of the matter. And you look at his take, and he chalks it all up to a mythology. So he takes the basically the entire book of Genesis, if not the entire Pentateuch, and says this is just principled mythology. We get lessons from it, but the stories themselves are not actually historical narrative. You can't trust anything of Scripture at that point. Everything across all of Scripture then is suspect. And it's a very short step from that to all of the fanciful opinions of the German higher critics. So that's on the one side, an example of how this one take, that it was a local flood, indicates that his hermeneutics, his way of looking at Scripture, is all wrong. On the other side, Gavin Ortlund believes it was a local flood, and I'm going to include his address, a link to his take on all of this. But he makes his decision based in large part, not entirely, but in large part, on the Scripture. So I agree an awful lot with Gavin Ortlund. Have a great respect for the man. No two theologians are ever going to agree down the line, but his hermeneutics are generally, as far as I've seen, safe. But you have to look, and it's just a little warning flag. Okay, if they take it as a local flood, let's look at the rest of their belief, how they believe it, why they believe it, and what the basis of their decision making is. Are they just trying to explain away the Bible to be more palatable to the rest of the world? Or are they trying to interpret Scripture based on Scripture? So with that said, a couple guardrails. First of all, we know if we're going to give a serious treatment to Scripture, that the flood had to wipe out all flesh. Genesis chapter 7, verse 4. Every living thing, in fact, not just humans, every living thing, or every living substance, as I believe the ESV says. So we know that this had to have taken place. If you and Gavin Ortland, by the way, happily agrees with this. He believes that the local flood could accommodate this. Again, trying to make sure that he is honest to the text. So I don't have time or interest to go through every single point he makes in the video. But to give a few of my responses, he goes into the grammatical bits about kol or eretz, or whole land or whole earth. He goes into that a lot and shows lots of examples about how this does not necessarily mean the entire planet. However, that's not the only way it's described. Also, if you look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 23, it uses the face Fani Adamah, or face of the world, face of the ground, rather. Adamah being the same place we get Adam, which is from the earth. This is a different phrase altogether than kol eretz. And forgive my Hebrew, we don't know, by the way, exactly how ancient Hebrew was pronounced, so therefore I'm right and everybody else is wrong because I declared it so. Anyway, this phrase from Genesis chapter 7, verse 23 is only used 4 times, and there's only one use of it outside of the Noahic narrative. That's in Genesis chapter 2, verse 6, and that is very clearly the whole planet. So you can't only pick that one little phrase and say that's the end of the conversation. There are other phrases that describe the flood that have to be alluded to. The next thing he alludes to the Genesis chapter 6 and the Nephilim. That's a little bit too much for me to try. Everybody always wants to know about the Nephilim. I have very strong opinions on that, but I'm going to do a separate video if I get a chance. For now, I'm a Sethite. Take that for what it's worth. If you don't know what that means, feel free to look it up. He talks about the universal interpretation of it being global prior to recent times. And by the way, Gavin Ortland is a historian. He's a theological historian, very well versed in the early church fathers. So, I mean, I'm not going to go double check that. He freely himself admits this was the universal interpretation, that the flood was global until recent times. Now, he talks about this, gives his thoughts on the matter. I thank him for being honest, but that does carry a tremendous amount of weight in my eyes. And lastly, to just address, he speaks of the fact that there are necessary miracles outside of the text in order to make a global flood necessary. I'll simply say he's making some assumptions, such as animal distribution. And you see this happens in evolutionary concepts, a universal extrapolation that things never changed. So, for example, if kangaroos are in Australia, they've never been anywhere other than Australia for all time, always. Well, I don't know, maybe they were in the, Garden of Eden, and they moved to Australia and adapted to Australia later on. And then he points out, well, about fossil records, well, I don't know, maybe there was a giant flood that either created a lot of the fossils we have, and also destroyed some of the fossils and moved plates around and all kinds of stuff. So I don't have any problem with all of that, with the miracles taking place, necessary miracles for the global flood that we don't read about explicitly, detail by detail, because the providence and sovereignty of God is not given to us detail by detail. That's not how Scripture reveals His work. He gives us the narrative of what He's doing, not the details of what He's doing. So I don't have a problem with that. He also, I found interesting, I did a little bit of quick math. He talked about families versus genus land vertebrates. So not including fish and not including invertebrates, because a lot of the invertebrates are either would have been able to survive without being on the ark, or would take up very, very little room, like thinking insects and whatnot. There are only 33,278 per the great interwebs Google search that I did, separate land vertebrate genuses. If you look at the square footage of the ark, and I know he makes a few comments about the ark encounter and the size of it, but using that as a benchmark, if we were to take the square footage of that and divide it equally to every land vertebrate by genus, not family, taking it down a level, they still have 4 square feet apiece. If I did my math right, which is very possible I made a mistake. But it's 101,000 square feet. There are 33,000 separate land vertebrate genuses. That's a lot of space, and they don't all need the same amount of space, and you can put a lot of them together in the same spaces. So that seems to me to work out remarkably well. So he's got a lot of other arguments. Here's the thing, and I want to encourage anybody who's watching this video, especially from Reliance Baptist Church, never be afraid to ask any question of Scripture, of the text. If we're afraid to ask the question, then we're not being honest with ourselves, we're not being honest with our faith, and we're not being honest ultimately with God. Ask the question. Be willing to say when you don't have an answer. Be willing to talk to others, and sometimes be comfortable with just not knowing and accepting in faith. But I think the plain, clear reading of the Noah account is a global flood, and I will leave anyone interested to consider or come to me, and we can talk with this through a little bit more, and whatever your thoughts might be on the matter. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you all on the Lord's Day. Bye.